Well, good afternoon, everyone. This hearing of the U.S. Senate Caucus on International Narcotics Control will come to order. And I'm just going to warn all of you that we've got a lot of names in foreign languages and things like that, but I'm sure our trusty court reporter will get it all down. I'll do my best to pronounce them correctly, but I wanted to warn you ahead of time. In February 2024, 3 Mexican nationals were arrested after police raided a meth lab connected with Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, or otherwise known as CJNG. In July 2024, law enforcement arrested 2 Mexican nationals after raiding a multi-million-dollar methamphetamine drug manufacturing lab on a farm. And last September, counterterrorism officers shut down a meth lab and arrested 2 men linked to the Sinaloa cartel. Mexican cartel drug lab busts occur so frequently that ordinarily there's nothing really surprising about them. But these raids didn't occur in the United States, nor did they occur in Mexico. These clandestine labs were actually spread over 3 separate continents. The first lab is located in the state of Punjab in India. The second was set up in South Africa, and the third was discovered near a city in northern Poland. Today, the Sinaloa cartel and CNG have a global footprint. Not only do they partner with local criminal organizations in Africa, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, but they are sending cocineros, or cooks, to produce meth and process cocaine literally around the globe. This caucus's first 2 hearings in the 119th Congress focused on the illicit activities of nefarious nature from outside the Western Hemisphere in our own backyard, namely Hezbollah, Chinese organized criminal groups. But today's hearing looks outward to expose the activities of Mexican drug cartels largely beyond the Western Hemisphere and the web of criminal connections that they have spun around the world. President Trump has made countering the cartels in Mexico a major priority of his second administration. Under his leadership, the government has designated these and other Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. The Treasury Department has imposed sanctions on individuals and institutions linked to the cartels. President Trump has worked to secure the extradition of numerous cartel operatives to face criminal charges here in the United States. And Mexico, under some pressure from the administration, has stepped up its own enforcement efforts, including deploying approximately 10,000 National Guard troops to the U.S.-Mexico border, and through an operation which eliminated CNG leader Nemesio Mencho Oseguera. There are indicators that these counter-narcotics efforts are helping reduce drug smuggling across our border. Nationwide fentanyl seizures by the DEA have decreased from a high of 77 million pills and 12,000 pounds of fentanyl powder in 2023 to 47 million pills and 10,000 pounds of fentanyl powder in 2025. As we all know, that's enough to kill every person in America many times over anyway, but thankfully the numbers seem to be moving in a more positive direction. CBP's seizures at the border have decreased from 26,700 pounds of fentanyl in 2023 to 11,500 pounds of fentanyl in 2025. So basically cut it less than half, maybe by 2/3. And the drug overdoses in the United States, including fentanyl poisonings, have fallen from a peak of around 111,000 in 2023 to about 68 or 69,000 deaths in the 12 months ending in January 2026. Again, a terrible tragedy to be sure, but still movement in a more positive direction. These are hopeful signs, but of course we cannot celebrate prematurely. According to the DEA, fentanyl trafficking rates are still too high. I think we can tell that by the numbers. And we're seeing increases in trafficking of other substances. But there is some reason for hope. I've said for a long time now, and borrowed this from others, that the cartels are commodity agnostic. In other words, they're in it for the money. During the Biden administration, they unfortunately opened the borders to illegal immigration into the country. And of course, that made the cartels a whole lot of money, trafficking in human beings and in drugs. And in the wake of the Trump administration's crackdown on drug trafficking, we can expect the cartels to further adapt. Not only are they commodity agnostic, but they also don't care who they sell to as long as they can make a buck. The European cocaine market is highly lucrative, and the cartels can fetch approximately double the price for cocaine in Europe compared to sales here in the United States. So it comes as no surprise, should come as no surprise, that the cartels are exploiting the European market. Nor is it surprising that the cartels have expanded trafficking to Australia and New Zealand, two of the most lucrative drug markets in the world, according to the DEA. These are businesses, albeit illegal ones, and the DEA sums up their global business strategy succinctly in a recent report. The global expansion of Mexican cartels allows traffickers to maximize reliance on a single drug market or revenue stream while maximizing profits. So the question is for us today, what does that mean for the United States? I would understand the temptation to dismiss this as Europe's problem, or India's problem, or Africa's problem, or Australia's problem. But where do those revenues from the drug sales ultimately flow? Well, they come right back to this continent, south of our border, to the country of Mexico, where they will only reinforce the cartels that we have been working hard in cooperation with our Mexican allies to eradicate. And the dangers go far beyond financial enrichment of these criminal organizations. There are reports that a Mexican cartel operative have joined foreign fighter units in Ukraine to acquire first-person view drone capabilities they could employ against law enforcement on our southern border. Furthermore, the cartels have strengthened ties with criminal groups all across the globe, which will only give them more opportunities to launder funds and make it harder to combat them. All of that said, the consequences for other countries and regions in the world are still stark. Sinaloa and CJNG drug cooks have exported their techniques that double and can double the output of a methamphetamine lab. In Ecuador, homicide rates spiked after the cartels enlisted Los Choneros and Los Lobos, a couple of local gangs, to distribute drugs for them. The cartels are not merely a U.S. problem or a Mexican problem, in other words. They are a global problem. The purpose of today's hearing is to investigate their worldwide activities. We will explore how the U.S. and other countries have been working to address this threat, and will identify opportunities to improve on those efforts. We have three excellent witnesses here with us today to help us think through these issues: former DEA agents Chris Urban and Michael Brown, and Vanda Felbob Brown of the Brookings Institution, who has extensively documented what she terms the, quote, foreign policies, close quote, of the Sinaloa cartel and CJNG. Without objection, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from Professor Joanna I'm going to struggle her name, Glukoswa Balak of the University of Warsaw in Poland, detailing the risks posed by Mexican cartel activities in Europe. So I look forward to a productive hearing, and I now turn the floor over to my co-chair, Senator Whitehouse, for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Cornyn. I have appreciated your leadership of this caucus and enjoy working with you to continue its long bipartisan collaborative tradition. We frequently discuss the activities of Mexican cartels and their destructive influence in the United States, Mexico, and across Latin America. I often say that these modern drug cartels operate more like Fortune 500 conglomerates than street gangs. Mexican drug cartels are a perfect example. Once upon a time, middlemen who muled Colombian cocaine across the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, global business empires that generate billions of dollars in ill-gotten wealth. Today, we'll shed a little light on that expansion beyond just the United States, Mexico, and Latin America. Mexican cartels are now present in European, African, and Asian streets, establishing markets and supply chains, addicting and killing young people with their product, corrupting politics and government, and reaping untold wealth. According to the DEA's 2025 threat assessment, the two most ruthless cartels, the Sinaloa cartel and the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, now operate in over 40 countries worldwide. They offer local gangs and organized criminal groups drugs, money, and weapons. They engage in and facilitate corruption on an enormous scale. They prop up corrupt leaders, infiltrate law enforcement agencies, and undermine institutions. Unwitting governments and American allies alike become less stable, reliable, and safe for their own citizens and for Americans who travel or do business there. These cartels have grown in influence, wealth, and footprint because we have failed to crack down on their financial empires. For nearly 50 years, we focused on drug distribution networks. Because the product is contraband, the cases are easy once the drugs are found, and everyone gets to take a well-earned photo with piles of drugs and weapons and cash taken off the streets. I have done that myself. But we ignore the business side at our peril. An estimated 70,000 Americans died of drug overdoses in 2025, including 219 of my fellow Rhode Islanders. If we want to be serious about fighting drug traffickers behind American deaths, we must strike at their financial networks. Globally, less than 1% of illicit financial flows are confiscated each year. At one of our hearings last Congress, a retired DEA agent told us fewer resources are dedicated to money laundering investigations today than 20 years ago. We're going in the wrong direction. We can and must turn that around. I worked with Senator Grassley in the first Trump administration to pass the bipartisan Corporate Transparency Act to identify who's behind anonymous corporations used in criminal schemes. But Treasury Secretary Bessent suspended enforcement of the law for all entities formed in the United States. In other words, 99% of the entities covered by the law, willfully blinding law enforcement investigating our country's most dangerous threats. Treasury must reverse course and fully implement the CTA as Congress envisioned. Drug traffickers, kleptocrats, and paramilitary groups rely on opaque free trade zones and transparency gaps in trade data to move contraband, profit from their ill-gotten gains, and finance violence. The Clean FTZ Act I co-lead with Senator Cassidy would enhance oversight of foreign free trade zones, including those in West Africa and Southeast Asia that are critical links in global drug trafficking networks. Likewise, our Manifest Modernization Act would shine a light on opaque import records to help law enforcement take down bad actors. For too long, the U.S. has allowed cartels, terrorists, rogue states, Chinese money laundering organizations, and foreign oligarchs to use phony U.S. shell corporations in their illicit schemes. These anonymous companies may exist only on paper, but they enable deadly threats to Americans' lives and security and to the stability of countries around the world. Treasury, by the way, should also close money laundering vulnerabilities in the investment and residential real estate sectors by implementing the rules that were finalized last year. The individuals servicing this corrupt and covert trade should be held accountable for their role empowering criminals who are killing Americans every day. A dark international economy now supports the cartels, but also kleptocrats, human traffickers, terror groups, and all manners of evil. We need to disable that structure. Treasury, DOJ, FinCEN, and other federal agencies on the front lines fighting against financial crime and corruption need more resources. It's as simple as that. We should work in a bipartisan way to make sure they have those resources and that those resources are not diverted to other priorities. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
Let me just say, Senator Whitehouse, the legislation that you and Senator Grassley passed that Treasury is not enforcing is very concerning to me. And if there's some way for us to make that in some way compulsory rather than optional, I'd love to work with you on that.
I would very much look forward to that, and I thank you for the kind offer.
Maybe you can explain to me how we can actually accomplish that, but I'm happy to work with you on it.
Gladly.
At this time, let me give a little bit more background of our witnesses because they all have very distinguished resumes in their own right. Chris Urban has spent more than 20 years with the DEA and has led sensitive global undercover operations targeting major transnational criminal organizations. Mr. Urban served in domestic and international assignments, including tours in Brussels, Luxembourg, and Northern Europe, collaborating extensively with international law enforcement agencies and overseeing U.S. DEA interests across Northern Europe and the Baltic region. He later served in the DEA's Special Operations Division and as Assistant Special Agent in charge of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and the Far East, where he led strategic efforts to address emerging international threats. Michael Brown is Global Director for Counter-Narcotics Technology at Rigaku Analytical Devices and the founder of Hopland Consortium. He served for more than 32 years as a special agent with the DEA, holding domestic and international assignments across the United States, South Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Mr. Brown conducted extensive counter-narcotics and international law enforcement operations, including service with Operation Snowcap in Central and South America, leadership roles in DEA offices in Pakistan, India, Myanmar, and Tajikistan, and coordination of regional operations across the Middle East, Asia, and Afghanistan. He served as acting and supervisory country attaché in multiple overseas postings and worked closely with foreign law enforcement, military, and intelligence partners. He's authored numerous articles on counter-drug strategy and law enforcement practices and is a frequent commenter on emerging narcotics threats, including the activities of Mexican cartels and global illicit chemical networks. Dr. Vanda Felbot Brown is a senior fellow at the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings Institution. She is the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors and the co-director of the Africa Security Initiative and the Brookings series, The Opioid Crisis in America, Domestic and International Dimensions. Dr. Felbot Brown has conducted extensive field work across regions including Afghanistan, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and she served as a senior advisor to the congressionally mandated Afghanistan Peace Process Study Group. Dr. Felbot Brown has authored several books and numerous policy reports on topics like organized crime, conflict, and drug policy. Mr. Urban, why don't we start with you, and I'd ask the witnesses to limit your opening comments to 5 minutes so we can have plenty of time for questions, and of course your written testimony will be made part of the record without objection. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. Chairman Cornyn and Co-Chair Whitehouse and distinguished members of this caucus, thank you for the opportunity to address you today on the global reach of the Mexican cartels and their threat to the national security of the United States. I saw firsthand the damage done by the cartels and with their international smuggling of narcotics, including fentanyl, during my 25-year career as an agent and executive with the DEA. I started off on the front lines targeting kingpins and command control of these networks of transnational organized crime who were trafficking drugs into the country and laundering funds through the U.S. financial institutions. I also spent time abroad at U.S. embassies in Brussels and Copenhagen, working with our international partners to increase collaboration against transnational organized crime. In 2018, I was assigned to DEA's Special Operations Division, SOD, where I led a global team that was focused on a new and emerging and evolving threat: Chinese money launderers and CMLOs, as they're described, and other elements of Chinese organized crime globally who would essentially become partners with the Mexican cartels. That was 2018. CMLOs launder the dominant share of Mexican cartel revenues, and Chinese suppliers provide the chemical precursors for the production of fentanyl and methamphetamine. Since their designation by the U.S. government as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, the cartel's operations have been materially impacted. Key successes against the cartels since designation, there are 4 of them that I want to mention. Over 100 of the top echelon Mexican cartel targets have been sent to the United States, and some appear to be cooperating. In July of 25, the U.S. Treasury utilized for the first time the FEND Act against 3 Mexican financial institutions. In February of this year, as mentioned earlier, the Mexican cartel leader El Mencho was killed in a Mexican military operation. In April of this year, the Southern District of New York charged 10 current and former Mexican government officials. This indictment clearly highlights the level of corruption within Mexico and has had significant impact, I believe. The Mexican cartels are being forced to evolve based on the dramatically increased threat from the U.S. government and the negative impact on their revenue streams. Recently, General Anderson of AFRICOM stated that within the last 24 months, 12 drug laboratories intercepted in Africa. Of those 12, 11 had members of the Mexican cartel among the operators at that lab. An unbelievable, number, really. General Anderson pointed out that this was an indicator of the growing presence of the Mexican cartels in Africa. In Poland, Mexican cartels-controlled methamphetamine labs have also been identified and taken down by Polish narcotics units on several occasions. During my work in Brussels and Copenhagen, I collaborated extensively with European counterparts and saw the level of corruption, organized crime violence, and control increase dramatically in countries like the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. This corruption and control has metastasized because of cocaine trafficking into ports in those countries. It poses a clear threat to the national security of those countries. The negative aspect in Europe that I just described is coupled with the increase in power by cartels, FTOs, in the Western Hemisphere, to include the Mexican cartels. By targeting key convergence points alongside European and African counterparts, we can dismantle the operations of the Mexican cartels. By targeting Mexican cartel operations outside the Western Hemisphere in jurisdictions like Europe, Asia, and Africa, we can negate a new and lucrative revenue stream that the Mexican cartels are going to focus on. The established money laundering partnership between the Mexican cartels and Chinese money launderers continues to evolve as crypto has taken on a much more substantial role in the laundering of funds. The U.S. government should be collaborating with all potential partners to attack the money laundering component of the Mexican cartels. The laundering of drug profits is a clear asymmetric weakness of the cartels and can be exploited with greater international cooperation and resources. Thank you to the caucus for this important issue of highlighting the global presence of the Mexican cartels. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Urban. Their second vote is on, but what I'd like to do is let's finish the next 2 opening statements. We'll take a brief recess and come back for questions. So, Mr. Brown.
Chairman Cornyn, Co-Chair Whitehouse, distinguished members of the caucus, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Today, I want to focus specifically on the alarming rise of Mexican drug cartels, which I see as an urgent and growing threat, specifically regarding the now designated foreign terrorist organizations, the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, also referred to as the CJ&G. I also want to explain how their partnership with U.S.-based drug trafficking organizations, or DTOs, along with the rapid proliferation of what I call the cottage industry independent trafficker, represent the rapid evolution of the American drug trafficking paradigm. The cottage industry trafficker is composed of ordinary people cashing in on a new digital drug market. Thousands of semi-independent trafficking cells operate below the radar with no single leader or clear hierarchy. Take down one cell, and another quickly self-replicates. The result is a decentralized criminal ecosystem. The Sinaloa and CJ&G cartels have become deeply entrenched transnational criminal organizations, posing a serious strategic threat to the United States. Over the past decade, they have built close working partnerships with major U.S.-based DTOs and prison gangs, including the Crips, the Bloods, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Latin Kings, and the Mexican Mafia. These alliances have transformed once regional criminal groups into primary distribution networks for cartel-produced fentanyl, reaching every city, every state, and every neighborhood. The entire system relies on two critical capabilities: cartels' steady access to precursor chemicals and their ability to smuggle fentanyl into the United States, often hidden in vehicles and within legitimate commercial cargo. As long as the supply chain remains in place, the U.S. fentanyl market will remain saturated. The cartel-U.S. DTO partnership now runs on a business model that accepts mass murder as part of its daily distribution cycle, resulting in the deaths of 80 to 100,000 Americans every year as just the cost of doing business. The cartel crisis threatens to outpace our law enforcement agencies and perhaps even our sense of morality. This just isn't a drug problem anymore. It's a critical threat to public health, national security, and foreign policy. The U.S. administration has designated the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and treats fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. So what is the next logical step to be taken when trying to mitigate the expansion of U.S. DTOs? Cartel FTOs and U.S. DTOs are working together in a coordinated effort to flood the homeland with fentanyl, demonstrating a total disregard for the thousands of American lives lost as a result. Their alliance is a clear, calculated partnership that's causing massive collective harm. This is a coordinated attack on American communities which could be perceived as a hyper form of narco-terrorism, weaponizing addiction, deceit, as an asymmetric tactic that moves beyond traditional profit-driven criminal activity. Let's be clear, there are no shades of gray. If we don't address the rapid expansion of the Mexican cartels through the evolution of U.S. criminal networks, we risk the normalization of mass murder as an acceptable and, worse yet, predictable outcome. Thank you.
Dr. Phil Bob Brown, please proceed.
Chairman Cornyn, Co-Chair White House, thank you for this opportunity to testify. I have been studying Mexican cartels in Mexico and outside of Mexico since 2005 in my role as a senior fellow at Brookings and also otherwise. The Brookings Institution is a U.S. nonprofit organization devoted to high-quality independent research and policy solution. My testimony represents solely my personal views and does not reflect the views of Brookings, its scholars, employees, officers, and/or trustees. As we have heard, over the past decade, the Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación have significantly expanded their operations outside of Mexico and outside of the United States. They flood Europe with cocaine, originating in Latin America and flowing through West Africa. They are trying to develop new market for cocaine in Australia, New Zealand, and Asia. Very worrisomely, they began promoting and trafficking methamphetamine production outside of the United States. They have set up meth labs in Europe and in Africa, as you highlighted, partnering up with local criminal actors and teaching them how to produce highly potent and highly lethal Mexican version of methamphetamine. In Australia, the Mexican cartels have recently surpassed the long-established Chinese criminal groups as dominant suppliers of meth. Beyond the high mortality and morbidity associated with Mexican meth, there is also the risk that methamphetamine use will become a vector for expanded fentanyl use, a highly lethal possibility. The cartels also smuggle meth through the Middle East and through the United States into Canada and then onto Asia. They launder money in all of these regions, such as working through Chinese money laundering networks. It is in Latin America where the cartel's presence is most extensively established. These days, it runs the panoply of issues from the facilitation of coca cultivation to trafficking through the continent to pill presses and precursor smugglings. The cartels also operate with Chinese and Indian criminal groups in the delivery of those precursors. Along the expanded trafficking routes, we frequently see significantly increased use of the drugs, such as in Africa and in Pacific Island nation, as the cartels pay their local partners in drugs rather than cash. But beyond drugs, the cartels are already expanding their operations into other commodities, not just in Mexico, but also outside of Mexico, into human smuggling and trafficking, into illegal gold mining, IUU fishing, and even wildlife trafficking, even in places like Africa, where the wildlife trafficking space is highly contested and established and populated by many other established groups. In various parts of Latin America, such as in Ecuador, Costa Rica, Chile, the cartel's presence has significantly augmented criminal violence and made it far more difficult for law enforcement agencies to deal with. Similar bad trends are underway, for example, in places such as Australia. The arrival of the cartels increases their firepower and other capacities. The arrival of the cartels increases the firepower and other capacities of local criminal groups and teaches them how to diversify beyond drugs. The cartel's presence also frequently leads to increased corruption. In sum, the expansion of Mexican cartels beyond North America poses multifaceted threats. It undermines US law enforcement efforts by creating resilient and redundant systems of drug production and trafficking, money laundering, and income flows. US actions in any one place become less effective. The expansion also weakens US partners. Beyond drug use and increased criminal violence, the threats include the loss of biodiversity, economic sustainability, and food security when the cartels promote wildlife trafficking or exacerbate IUU fishing. Wildlife trafficking can spread zoonotic diseases or other diseases affecting livestock, as we see in Texas with the screwworm threat. Mexican cartels' activities could undermine the security of US supply chains, including in critical mineral and supply chains of partners. And the risks also include risks to democracy, when criminal violence and corruption gives rise to authoritarianism or creates opportunity for hostile powers such as Russia. In short, there is an even more important need for expanded global cooperation that the United States needs to lead. Its elements should include helping governments develop the intelligence and capacity against the cartels, dismantling meth labs of Mexican cartels and other synthetic flows, but also countering their operations beyond drugs, such as by dismantling money laundering networks associated with them. All these efforts need to take place within a strong effort to reduce corruption, patronage systems, and establish apolitical independent legal systems, investigative journalistic work, and scrupulously adhere to human rights and civil liberties, and also holding law enforcement accountable. Thank you.
I can resume our hearing. Thank you. I might ask you, Mr. Urban, Mr. Brown, both of you worked for a long time in the DEA, and one thing I've learned is that nothing much happens around the world without American leadership, and I appreciate the good, important work DEA has done and continues to do. But talk to us a little bit about the cooperation you get from other countries on this challenge. I just don't have much of a framework of understanding exactly. Are you getting support? Is it, how would you characterize it? And Mr. Urban, why don't you start?
So in terms of global support, I think we need to highlight for the rest of the world that the Mexican cartels have now been designated as foreign terrorist organizations. So the threshold of evidence is actually very low. For example,
That designation actually changes the legal threshold?
Absolutely. So, for example, when you spoke about, sir, the methamphetamine labs in South Africa that were taken down, that were controlled by the Mexican cartels, that methamphetamine, in theory, never touched the United States. However, since the cartels have now been designated, that conduct is material support, essentially, of the Mexican cartels. It's benefiting the Mexican cartels. So that low threshold, which has now just come into play in the last really 12 to 18 months, but we'll say last 12 months, we can be utilizing those authorities in a much more robust manner. In terms of our cooperation with counterparts that either my co-panelist Mike Brown has worked with or myself, we have excellent relationships around the globe that we've developed over decades. So whether it's in the Baltic states, Northern Europe, Brussels, Africa, Asia, wherever the cartels exist, we should be prioritizing with our counterparts and explaining that the threshold of evidence is very low and that they're a priority for us right now.
Mr. Brown?
I spent roughly 10 years in Pakistan, 5 years in India, 3 years in Myanmar, and the host country cooperation is very good, but the biggest issue is we do not have compatible legal systems. So if I want to do something in the U.S., an extradition or a certain type of investigation in India or Pakistan, their laws prohibit that. There's no unified legal system that helps us fight global trafficking. So the traffickers know if they go to certain countries, they can get past DEA and get past U.S. laws because those countries won't look at the problem in the same manner. And I think, when we look at global narcotics trafficking, we have to compare that to the unilateral cooperation we have with terrorism, for example. A lot of countries, we have a symbiotic relationship with many countries concerning the investigation of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or terrorist leads through the intelligence community. We don't have that same connectivity when it comes to the Sinaloa and CJ&G cartels as they metastasize across the globe. As soon as they get to another country, cooperation then becomes questionable.
Dr. Feldbaum Brown, you talked about the diversification of the business of the cartels. They don't necessarily just invest in drug production and distribution. You mentioned things like gold mining, wildlife, trafficking. It seems like they have almost an endless capacity to evolve into some illegal activity that they continue to make money from. And describe, please, what challenges that presents to law enforcement or the efforts of organizations like the DEA and others to actually get after this problem.
Well, thank you, Senator Cornyn. It presents enormous challenges to law enforcement in multiple ways. One, obviously, is even if a country such as the United States could shut down the supply chain of drugs from a particular locale, it will not bankrupt the criminal entity, the Sinaloa cartel or Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, because they are so diversified into other commodities. In Mexico, they not simply operate across a wide range of illegal economies, they are directly taking over legal commodities and legal economies as well. Outside of Mexico, they have not had the same capacity to do it, but their exemplar, their diversification into other commodities is an example for other criminal groups to emulate. And that's the second threat. So not only do they have these redundant systems of trafficking, of production, and of money flows and money laundering, they are also teaching other criminal groups to diversify in the same way. Whether they teach that purposefully or simply the groups observe how much they have gained power, political influence, and economic benefit out of it. So that's the second threat, that local groups become strengthened as they learn from the Mexican cartels, and our partner countries, other governments with whom we see cooperation, become weaker.
Several of you have mentioned money laundering, and could you explain with the advent of cryptocurrencies and other ways to basically hide the ball and anonymous transactions, how has that affected our ability to detect and dismantle these global operations? Started with you, Mr. Urban.
So the Chinese money launderers in or about 2018 changed the game because they created globally a mirror transaction system where those funds don't cross borders. So it became very difficult for financial institutions to track illicit activity, red flags, things like that. In conjunction with the Chinese money launderers creating this system globally and becoming the primary money launderers for the Mexican cartels, crypto up until about 2022, 2023 was still used in a limited basis as a final asset that a drug trafficker would hold that crypto wallet. Starting in about 2022, 2023, crypto became very much involved in that mirror transaction between the United States and Mexico for the Mexican cartels. It was a service offered by other money laundering brokers with the Chinese to the Mexicans, and they took advantage of it because it just added another layer of protection or anonymity. So crypto, again, up until about 2022, was used, give or take 10, 20% of transactions. It's now used easily over 50%, probably more like 60, 70% of the transactions between the United States and Mexico as a component of that money laundering mirror transaction.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Dr. Felby-Brown, I noticed in your testimony that you made mention of IUU fishing. That's an area that I pursue. For those of you who don't, IUU stands for illegal, unreported, unregulated. I use a simpler term. I call it pirate fishing. And it is primarily accomplished by either mysteriously owned pirate-run, effectively slave ships that operate out on the ocean in the open seas beyond national borders, and the Chinese fishing fleet, which operates in a very similar way, often through fake ownership structures, false flags, and so forth. And I think I'm slowly convincing people that this pirate fishing enterprise is about a lot more than fishing, that particularly the Chinese fishing fleet has a lot to do with Chinese intelligence gathering and Chinese military influence. I think I'm slowly convincing the State Department that there's a huge opportunity here for the United States of America because so many coastal countries are so irritated and bedeviled by pirate fishing, particularly the abuses of the Chinese fishing fleet, which cheats with impunity in EEZs and is only happy to go in and scoop out a country's fishing stock that their local economy depends on. So there's a whole lot going on there, and I was interested in your connection of that to the Mexican cartels. Could you elaborate on that for me?
Thank you very much for your leadership in the IUU fishing space and at the White House. It is absolutely vital, and this much more expanded set of threats that you articulated is absolutely what's going on, certainly with state-sponsored IUU fishing, such as by China, but also by countries such as Russia, that often devastate the exclusive economic zones of countries in Africa and that lead to poverty and conflict exacerbation. So the Mexican cartels intersect with this in several ways. In Mexico, they are taking over fisheries, illegal fisheries as well as legal fisheries. But they are also partnering up with vessels, often official fishing fleets, that are nonetheless fishing illegally in places such as Costa Rica and Central America. They use those ships not just to transport drugs, but to buy fish that's been illegally harvested, bring it into Mexico and sell it in Mexico. They often force hotels, establishments to buy the fish that they either illegally bought themselves or they bought from fishermen, whether fishermen in Mexico or also outside of Mexico.
Gangster style. I'll make you a deal you can't refuse.
Absolutely.
Nice little hotel you got here.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I think would be helpful in this space would be to have there be the equivalent of a kind of an international traffic ticket anytime a vessel flips off its transponder. Because it seems to me that much of the illicit behavior engaged in by the shadow fleet of tankers, the shadow fleet of pirate fishers, they accomplish by flipping off their transponders and then going dark, doing whatever it is that they need to do, and then coming back on. Or if they're more complicated, they spoof the satellite so that the satellite is being told where the vessel is, but the vessel isn't where it's being told. The vessel's going in a very different direction. Then you get these miraculous moments when it has to resync, and a multi-ton vessel supposedly has traveled, 400 miles in 20 minutes. Miraculous high-speed vessel. There was also a very interesting graphic that I want to say the New York Times put together that showed how the Chinese fishing fleet on a certain date was spread out all across the Pacific, and then evidently on a signal, they all moved to create a single line of fishing vessels all up and down one line of longitude, I guess it would be. It was north to south. And they actually moved together as if commanded in a military operation. When you consider the conflict over space and control in the Pacific, that looks like an act of, if not war, preparation for war. What do you think about that? The idea of if you shut off your transponder, something happens, and of the militarization of the Chinese fishing fleet.
Let me start with the second question. You are absolutely right. I too noted when that happened, and I consider it a piece of evidence that denials by the Chinese government that the IUU fishing fleet is disconnected from any kind of larger direction does not seem very likely. It did seem absolutely like a behavior of a potential militia, which is not to say that every single activity of every single Chinese fishing ship is directed, but it certainly seems to have very much the possibility to utilize the fishing fleet as a militia, such as for conflict in the South China Sea. The issue of the AIS transponders is indeed becoming more complicated. It's not just going dark. More and more we see the systems being spoofed, and that makes it particularly hard to counter. The larger issue even is, however, that even when it is identified that the transponder makes no sense, that multiple signals for the same ships are appearing across different zones, or all of a sudden the location is very far apart, or where the ship goes dark, there is not necessarily any kind of capacity to act. Many governments lack maritime assets to counter fishing, even within their exclusive economic zones, let alone in blue water. So I think it's really important to enhance the shipwrighter agreements and cooperative agreements that U.S. Coast Guard has been developing during the Biden administration with governments if they don't have the capacity to do inspections, such as against IUU fishing, but more broadly against other contraband, or the possibility that hostile fleets or Russian fishing fleets carry intelligence equipment to inspect them. So enhancing those cooperative agreements between U.S. Coast Guard and countries around the world would be very important. I would also add here one other element, if I might, going back to the Mexican cartels. The Biden administration, for the first time in 2024, I believe, issued Treasury indictments against Mexican cartels, in this case the Gulf cartel, and their IUU fishing in the Caribbean. And this is something we should be seeing more. The Treasury Department during the Biden administration has very appropriately been indicting Mexican entities for oil smuggling, for all kinds of other activities, and I would love to see more of those indictments in the natural resource domains.
Great. Well, I'm way past my time, so I'll just conclude by thanking you and asking you to work with my team on what we can do to develop a response for the transponder violations. They're not violations, but they should be. I believe that Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landau has really become a believer in this space, so I think we have some voices in the Department of State to work with. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, earlier this week, the Associated Press published a damning article outlining how federal authorities in New Mexico, quote, allowed drug shipments to go unseized as part of a broader effort to gather intelligence and build cases against major drug traffickers. My question, sir, is built off what a DEA whistleblower said, which is those unseized shipments can't be accounted for, as many as 1.8 million pills. Yes or no, during your time as a DEA agent, was it standard operating procedure to allow millions of fentanyl pills to go unseized?
Well, when I was on the job working street investigations, there was no fentanyl. It was simply cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine. And at times, depending on the scale of the investigation, narcotics coming across the border were followed. We tried to follow it to its destination, and at that time, we would make the arrest and make the seizure. So I know the case you're referring to, but it would be hard for me to comment on it because I don't know the details of the investigation.
Mr. Urban, any similar question to you? Is this normal?
So anytime a federal agent is conducting an investigation and has control of the pills, right, or the narcotic, they should be seized. Investigations are difficult. They're evolving. Again, that was just an initial article that I read and skimmed. But if you can control the pills, you should seize them.
I appreciate that. Mr. Brown, what other tactics could federal agents have used in running an investigation like this rather than allowing narcotics just to flow through the streets at this level? Are there other tools that agents have or that Congress should be empowering agents to fully take advantage of?
Well, referencing my experience in following what we call drug shipments, we would use old school trackers. I think the technology we have today between trackers and drones is more than sufficient to track these shipments without actually giving away your surveillance operations. So I would encourage the use and the research of more technical means of monitoring these shipments and tracking them to their ultimate location so they are not lost.
I appreciate that, Mr. Brown. Now, this is an area, Mr. Chairman, that, look, the announcement from Attorney General Bondi was that they had the largest drug bust in America in the history. My concern is how many pills stayed on the streets and how many people died during this. And is there a better way? Should there be a better way? And this is an area where I hope that, whatever the setting is, that we can learn more about what's happening in those particular areas. Mr. Urban, in your testimony, you highlighted, and you were asked a question earlier as well around crypto. Crypto has taken as much more substantial role in laundering of funds, laundering of drug profits, et cetera, et cetera. Why is cryptocurrency such an attractive mechanism to facilitate illicit finance, and how could Congress stop the flow of funds? And my question specifically there is, are there any known loopholes, known vulnerabilities that Congress should include in upcoming legislation to eliminate loopholes that allow terrorists and cartels to make a bunch of money and get rich off of these illicit activities?
So as the cartels evolved in terms of using crypto, right, the crypto companies themselves are evolving in terms of their compliance programs. They have enhanced compliance, but I think their compliance programs should be similar to banking institutions and the equivalent, or to some degree even greater, because of the anonymity with crypto. The cartels essentially discovered crypto as a mechanism that they really liked to use for whatever reason after 2022 and 2023. In terms of law enforcement, they're learning the investigative components of investigating crypto. So I think additional funding specifically for crypto investigations would be helpful. They've gotten better at it and they're becoming good at it. But I think as much as it's being utilized right now, additional funding from Congress would be useful for federal law enforcement to have on crypto investigations.
Just so that I'm clear on what you responded there, you shared that at the very least, what Congress should do is require the same as traditional finance, if not more. Is that fair to say, not less?
Absolutely.
I appreciate that very much. And Chairman, I certainly hope that as we talk about, DeFi is a word that, or a couple of words that everyone's using around town. It's illicit finance. There's briefings right now that the banking committee's put together that are in a SCIF, that are classified. about known loopholes that are being used. And I certainly hope that we can find agreement to close known loopholes to prevent people that are doing bad things in America from doing even more of them. So very much appreciate that today and look forward to following up. Thank you both.
Mr. Brown, you have 32 years of service with the DEA, and obviously you've developed expertise on how the Mexican cartels exploit various means of getting their product into the country to the consumer. Can you talk a little bit about legal trade flows? For the benefit of the caucus, could you lay out how the cartels take advantage of vulnerabilities in the international trade system?
Well, the cartels have three critical capabilities, in my opinion, that allow them to thrive. One is their access to precursor chemicals. Two, their ability to smuggle bulk narcotics globally through commercial cargo or private vehicles. And three, as we were talking about, the money laundering operations. But in all the countries I've worked in, Central and South America, Southeast Asia, Europe, the primary means of smuggling narcotics, without question, is through maritime trafficking. Coming across the border in the U.S., it's commercial cargo and vehicles. The cartels know that governments, the United States government, Europe, Asia, they do not have the resources to search 100% all the cargo coming in. That is the Achilles heel of every country in the world. As volume and commercial shipping increases, that's cover for the cartels. Front companies, fake manifests, corruption in the ports, all enable the cartels to exploit that weakness. For example, San Isidro, port of entry, on an average day, 70,000 vehicles come across that border, 30,000 parcels. The cartels know Customs CBP can only search maybe 1% to 2% because of the sheer volume, and of course traffic has to move. Trade cannot be impeded. So they are using our trade or global trade as a cover to smuggle multiple tons of narcotics globally. Until we can really address that critical capability, it's going to be very hard to degrade the capability of the cartels to globally smuggle multiple tons of narcotics.
I don't know what the current number is, but I think it's somewhere around 20,000 trucks a day come across the port of Laredo. I think it's the largest inland port in the country. And obviously there are X-ray and other technical devices to be able to ascertain whether contraband is in any of those vehicles. Do you happen to know what percentage of the vehicles that cross, for example, and cross our southern border, are actually X-rayed or use other technical means to determine whether there's contraband? Is it a small sample or something approaching 100%?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for CBP is which vehicles do we search? What are the indicators that say we should search this truck or this vehicle over another? And those indicators are very hard to come by. CBP has the latest technology, but again, it's about the numbers, not the technology. For instance, airline travel. Pre-9/11, we could get on a plane, we could take luggage, there was no issue. Post-9/11, nobody gets on a plane unless there's an inspection. Luggage, it's a 100% inspection, and if you have to stand in line, they tell you get to the airport early. So until we really look at how are we going to mitigate the ability of the cartels to use that critical vulnerability within our trade system and our inspection system, we will continue to be flooded with narcotics, especially fentanyl.
Dr. Philbot Brown, you in February published an article where you wrote Mexican cartels have been learning sophisticated use of advanced drones from watching Ukraine's battlefield. Can you speak to the risks of the cartels pose if they bring this sort of sophisticated technology into their efforts to import drugs or perhaps exact violence on law enforcement or others?
Even before the reports showed up that the Mexican cartels were presumably sending operatives to the Ukraine battlefield, they were using drones. They are using drones for several purposes. One is to smuggle drugs into prison, so often small amount of contraband. They have weaponized drones and are using it to attack law enforcement officials in Mexico. But they are also using drones, particularly the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, to attack populations. We see primitive explosives known in Mexico as potato bombs loaded on drones with the purpose of mining entire fields in places like Michoacan and driving hundreds of thousands of people out of their location so they can control the land, particularly land where they do not have connections to the populations or they find desirable because there is access to water, for example, for production of methamphetamine. So their presence in Ukraine and just their observations of what is happening globally allows them to develop more sophisticated mechanisms, such as having drones on fiber optic tethers that makes jamming far harder. This could facilitate their flying drones across the US-Mexico border, which they are doing already, to smuggle drugs. And because synthetic opioids are so much less bulky, so much less heavy than cocaine or heroin, this method becomes more feasible. It's not as efficient as moving drugs through legal ports of entry in cars or container trucks, but it becomes more feasible. So there are immense risks with surveillance, with intimidation of law enforcement officials, of government officials, of general populations, attacks, violence, as well as enhanced smuggling of drugs.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks. I'd like to particularly ask the DEA witnesses to respond to my observations in my opening comments about the sort of financial apparatus that supports the cartels. My theory, my experience in all of this was that when this began, they were running drugs over the border into the US. They had to get paid. They had to deal with the cash. They had to figure out how to bring it back and then figure out where they could deposit it. But the cash and finance function was a secondary adjunct to the drug sales. Obviously, you need to get the money back, but it was just part of that. And then it became apparent that there was enough money to be made in coping with the money side of the transaction, that began to grow, and that once you were good at hiding bad guys' crooked money, you could now market yourself to crooked gangster thugs running countries in Africa, to human trafficking and international criminal organizations, to terror groups, to anybody who had money that they needed to hide and transfer around illicitly. And at that point, the financial apparatus kind of popped loose and became its own domain that now has its own structure and its own, it's sort of like its own separate dark economy. And it serves all of these various illicit enterprises. And it seems to me that we were paying too little attention to the money side back when the money side was just the drawback of cash from the sales, and it was nothing more than that. Now that it's metastasized into being this sort of financial creature that supports so many illicit, unlawful, dangerous activities, things that are really anathematic to American success, the scale of our effort in defeating it has not gotten, the effort hasn't gotten any better, and the scale has actually shrunk because the target has blown up. How would you describe it? That's my description of it. I wanted to put my cards on the table. And in particular, if one is, we really suck at this and we need to do a ton more, and 10 is, hey, we got this, there's nothing to worry about here, folks, where do you think we are right now on 1 to 10 in dealing with the financial enterprise?
So I'll start now and work back. I would say 5, right, in terms of the number between 1 and 10. Let's start from the beginning in terms of what you talked about, where the level of sophistication has exponentially increased over the last 20 years. Back 20 years ago, it was a much more simplistic money laundering scheme, whether it be the Colombians or the Mexican cartels with bulk cash going across the border. And then the black market peso exchange came into play, and that was a much more sophisticated operation through wire transfers, smurfing cash into banks to get back the funds to the cartels themselves. The Chinese, and it became more sophisticated over time with Hezbollah. They were sophisticated money launderers out of Europe for cocaine shipments there and around the world. And then, like I said, the black market peso exchange. The Chinese have changed the game. The reason they changed the game were several reasons. And it plays into what we've been talking about the entire panel so far. They can launder money, whether it's out of Africa with wildlife trafficking, gold smuggling. They can utilize any component of Chinese organized crime and revenue streams, and they can facilitate the movement of those funds anywhere in the world. So what they're doing here in the United States, they can do in Africa with mirror transfers. They can do it in Asia with the scam compounds. They can facilitate all of this because they have technology, they have a global presence, they have a global diaspora, and there are funds everywhere in the globe that allows them to think of giant pots of money where the funds don't actually have to leave that country. It's just a mere transfer.
And they exist independent of the criminal enterprises that they support. It's like, I'm no longer just your cash guy in the company, I'm the bank, and I serve a whole bunch of different customers.
Absolutely. They're independent, they're in partnership, right? I'll give you an example in 2018, when I led the efforts out of SOD on an operation called Project Sleeping Giant that studied exactly what we're talking about today in terms of the money flows from Chinese organized crime, Chinese malign influence with fishing vessels, and how that was happening with such speed. The Chinese essentially partnered with the Mexican cartels. And I remember asking the top 100 agents investigating this in meetings that we used to have, can anyone in the room tell me of a Chinese money launderer that's been kidnapped, extorted, killed in Mexico? Nobody. Why? Because they're in partnership. They value what the Chinese are offering. They've enriched the Mexican cartels beyond their wildest dreams because they absorbed all the risk and they could transfer the money back within a day at 1% to 2%. This happens around the world with all the organized crime activities that we're talking about. The Chinese will move money for essentially anybody. The Colombian cartels, all the other cartels designated in the last year and a half in our hemisphere, they'll do that for everybody. So you're talking about an uber sophisticated organization that has encrypted communications, which is another component to this that we can't wiretap. So you take all of that together, and again, the global scale of what we're discussing, and it's very difficult to penetrate, right? It's very difficult to take down. What Mike was talking about earlier is cells can replicate themselves, right? So whether it's on the drug side or the money side, you have money laundering cells under the umbrella of Chinese money launderers. I think in terms of what you were talking about in terms of solutions, the first one is the legislation. The faster government investigators have enriched information that's transparent and accurate, they can identify the network and take action. The second part of this is funding. I think we haven't kept pace with the scale which this happened. We've already described it. So you need specific funding and a unit stood up that's tailored and funded, fully funded, to go after Chinese money launderers around the globe and utilizing sanctions, utilizing the FEND Act, right, which is a very low threshold for impact, and then utilizing any other authorities that we have, and there are many, to go after specific cells that operate in the United States. And lastly, these same Chinese money launderers are moving, whether it's illegal fishing, whether it's prostitution, whether it's human smuggling, various components of organized crime. And for the top tier operators of Chinese money launderers, you could use the racketeering laws of the United States. So they exist in plain sight, a lot of these people. It's an attack strategy where you go after them aggressively with authorities that make sense at the time.
I'm going to ask the remaining two witnesses to respond as questions for the record, because I've used up more than all of my time, but I would be interested in your responses if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to write down your response after the fact. Thank you.
Senator Luzon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciated your questioning on how much fentanyl is drugs, illicit substances are coming into the United States through our borders, how little is inspected. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Chairman, back in 2020 and 21, a lot of us worked with you, and we received your support, which I appreciate, sir, your leadership. Senator Whitehouse, you were a part of this as well, where there was legislation passed in 2020 that required the Department of Homeland Security to submit a report to Congress how to achieve 100% screening on our southern border. And they did a report. It was due in 2021, but it came back, and it ultimately resulted in a little more than $1 billion for something called Recon 2.0, and $1.1 billion investment. $1.1 billion, I mean, they might be able to design an ad campaign with that much money. If the United States goes back and does the analysis on what it took to get to TSA compliant post 9/11 security, a technology that was developed at one of our national labs that came out of brain imaging, we need to build that to scale so that cars can drive through it, cargo ships can drive through it, cargo containers coming into our ports can go through it, as opposed to getting offloaded at a ship and then they put on a truck, and then the truck drives to an inland facility, and then the cartels steal the precursor chemicals in the United States, drive them to Mexico, and then it comes back as fentanyl. I see heads nodding with me in agreement here, because that's the truth. That's what's happening with all this stuff. Well, my Republican colleagues led an effort during Big Beautiful Bill and Reconciliation 2. Homeland Security now has more money than the Marines do. So this administration could do something significant and make me look like I didn't know what I was doing when I voted against it. We could get to 100% screening now if they move that from $1.1 billion to just $10 billion, worked with our national labs, worked with the intelligence community, developed screening that would help us in America. I believe that we could achieve 100% screening inbound and outbound. And there's a few pilot projects now that are proving to be positive for large cargo containers. But if I'm not mistaken, under Biden, Trump 1 and Biden, the reports that came back from DHS were similar. It was like less than 10% of cargo vehicles were screened coming into the southern border. 90% of the fentanyl that was seized at the southern border, if I have my numbers correct, came from passenger vehicles driven by women, younger women, because that was less likely to get screened. You were in a nice little, I don't want to call out one company because I'll get calls from some CEO or something, but one little cargo car, one small little passenger car driven by a younger woman, you were less likely to get stopped and searched. That's where we know the fentanyl was coming in, just in cars. And so, Chairman, I want to applaud you for that line of questioning. I think there's something we can do here, and I would invite all the experts, everyone watching, Secretary Markwayne Mullen, get these folks in gear, man, and get this Science and Tech Directorate in a way where I think we can do something meaningful. And what I would hope we would see here, Chairman, is 100% screening, not just inbound, 100% screening outbound. So, Senator Whitehouse, to your question, if people are driving money out or whatever, they're not using crypto, but they're starting to move guns or ammo, or they're using other things of value, and we're shipping them out of the states, we can find them too. And I just certainly hope that with the investment that we see now and the money available, because money's not an issue right now, to Homeland Security, that we could get there. So just want to applaud you there, Mr. Chairman. I hope we can get something meaningful done in that space.
I just have one last question. President Xi of the People's Republic of China, in his public remarks from time to time, will talk about the century of humiliation for China. And this is a concept for a period of history beginning with the end of the First Opium War and terminating with the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Communist Party rule in 1949. So I just want to get your reaction to this. I know a lot of the precursors that are necessary to manufacture fentanyl in Mexico come from China. And I know different administrations have tried to negotiate some sort of enforcement operation with the Chinese government itself. And I realize some of these precursors have more than one use. In other words, they have legitimate uses as well as illegitimate uses. But I'd be hard to state a circumstance under which a foreign country was so involved in a process which ultimately led to the death of tens of thousands of Americans without some sort of repercussion. And I just wonder, Mr. Urban, Mr. Brown, and actually all the witnesses, can you give us your views on Chinese cooperation on the precursors that are necessary for the manufacturing of fentanyl in Mexico? Mr. Urban?
I mean, it's limited. You know, if we had access to data and they decided to enforce compliance to Western standards to Chinese multinational chemical companies, you know, it would be difficult for those precursors to get to the Mexican cartels. And if they shared data on a basis where we could affect, you know, our investigations. Lastly, listen, the Chinese control what's happening within China, so they can control those companies. Right? I mean, it's that simple at some point.
They seem pretty good at controlling their population and the mass surveillance of their people. Mr. Brown, do you have any additional thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think one of the additional challenges is the evolution of what I call narcochemistry, right? 10 years ago, we knew if it was potassium pentagonate, we could go after it, we regulated it. But the chemists now have come up with what we call the precursors, where you could basically go into Home Depot, not that Home Depot's involved, but you could go into a hardware store and buy precursors, mix them, and create a stage 1 or stage 2 precursor. So the science has gotten more technical to now where the Mexican traffickers and the cooks are working in conjunction with the cooks in China who say, hey, here's a new recipe for methamphetamine. Here's a new recipe for fentanyl. So that adds on to the additional challenges of working with China at the bilateral level on regulating some of these now precursors, which do have legitimate use.
And getting back to the theme of this hearing, these individuals that are able to take those precursors and produce fentanyl from those, they can operate anywhere in the world. Dr. Feldbaugh-Brown, do you have any observations?
I would add one important comment, and that is that several U.S. administrations, the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and the second Trump administration all negotiated with China to schedule either fentanyl or analogs of fentanyl or a variety of precursors. And after a lot of bargaining, diplomacy, at which China has become distressingly effective, China does it. Each time China schedules, Chinese traffickers move to non-scheduled precursors, often teaching their clients, such as Mexican cartels, how to produce meth or fentanyl. The core loophole remains unaddressed and has remained unaddressed across the second Trump administration, despite the imposition of tariffs on China and the bargaining that we have seen. Chinese laws do not contain material support clauses, racketeering clauses, know your customer requirements. And so as long as Chinese traffickers move non-scheduled chemicals, they can be Chinese traders. Chinese law enforcement says we cannot act against them. So the most important element that we should be raising in our bilateral conversations with China related to drugs is to close this loophole. It's a big thing for a country to change its laws. China changed its laws to schedule the entire class of fentanyl, but it is this vulnerability, the lack of material support clauses, lack of racketeering charges, that allow Chinese nefarious entities to continually evade law enforcement by moving non-scheduled chemicals.
Well, we've now come to a conclusion of the hearing, and let me again thank all of our witnesses for sharing your expertise and answering our questions. We may, in fact, have, as Senator Whitehouse said, some additional questions post-hearing, and if you would please entertain those we'll set a deadline of maybe about a week, and if you would answer those questions, we would very much appreciate it. But the hearing is now adjourned.